My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 8:47 in the evening. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock on the microwave, not really seeing it, just needing something to look at that wasn't the photo albums piled on the dining room table. Mum's face smiled out from a dozen different frames. Mum at 30, holding me as a newborn with that look of wonder that first-time mothers get. Mum at 60, cutting a ribbon at some charity event she'd organised, wearing that proud smile she always had when she was doing something important. Mum in that last hospice photo, the one where you could barely recognise her anymore because the cancer had taken so much from her, but she was still smiling. That's what kills me about that photo. She was dying. She was suffering. She was in pain. And she was still smiling. That was Mum. The phone kept buzzing. I almost didn't answer it. That was my first instinct. I'd been getting calls all week, sympathetic colleagues who didn't really know what to say, distant relatives coming out of the woodwork, neighbours I hadn't spoken to in years, everyone wanting to say the right thing, and none of them knowing what the right thing actually was, none of them understanding that there is no right thing to say when someone's mother dies. There's just silence, or there's noise, and both feel equally wrong. But this call felt different. I don't know how to explain it. There was something in the timing, something in the way the phone kept vibrating against the granite countertop like it was insistent, like whoever was calling knew I was ignoring them and was determined not to be ignored. I picked it up. It was Patricia Donnelly. She was the primary nurse at Riverside Hospice where Mum had spent her final 3 weeks. I recognised her voice immediately, but there was an edge to it I'd never heard before. Patricia had always been calm, professional, gentle with Mum. The kind of nurse you pray for when someone you love is dying. The kind of person who makes those final days bearable. But now her voice was tight, strained, like she was trying very hard to keep it together. "I know it's late," she said. "I know it's been a week since the funeral, and I probably shouldn't even be calling you, but—" She stopped. There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, and it was shaky, like she'd been crying or was about to. "But what?" I asked. My stomach was already doing something strange, that feeling you get when you know something's wrong before anyone's told you, that primitive instinct that says danger. "I need you to come to the hospice," she said. The words came out quick, tumbling over each other, like she had to say them before she lost her nerve or changed her mind. "I need you to come right now, or tomorrow morning at the latest. There's something you need to see. Something about your mother. I shouldn't be telling you this. I know I shouldn't be calling. I could lose my job, but you need to come." I was already standing up, reaching for my keys on the hook by the door. My heart was pounding. "Patricia, what is it? What's wrong? Is someone in trouble? Is there a problem with how she was treated?" "Just come," she said. "Please. Tomorrow morning if you can't tonight. I'm here until 6 a.m, but you need to see this for yourself. I can't explain it over the phone, and I can't send you pictures or documents digitally. You need to come here and see it with your own eyes." "See what?" I asked, but she'd already hung up. The line went dead. I stood there with the phone in my hand, listening to the dial tone, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. That night was the longest night I'd had since Mum actually died. At least when she was dying, there was something to do. There was medication to administer, calls to the nurses, vigils to keep. There was purpose to the waiting. But this was different. This was pure not knowing. This was my mind running through every possible scenario while I sat in the dark kitchen, with cold coffee getting colder and colder. What could Patricia have possibly found? What could be so urgent, so serious, that a nurse would violate whatever confidentiality agreements she'd signed just to tell me to come back to that place? What could be bad enough to make her risk her career? I'd lost my mother exactly 1 week before that call. 7 days. Long enough to start getting used to the idea that she was gone. Long enough that some mornings I'd wake up and for just a few seconds, I'd forget, and then remember, and feel the loss all over again like it was fresh and new and unbearable. But not long enough to move past the fog of grief, not long enough to process everything that had happened in those final months. The truth is, her illness had been this slow burn that built into an inferno. It started in September. Mum had been complaining about being tired, more tired than usual. She was 78, still active, still volunteering at the library on Thursdays, still hosting Sunday dinners where she'd make her famous pot roast and her legendary apple pie that my brother and I had been eating our whole lives. But that tiredness seemed different, not like normal aging. Not like the kind of tired you feel at the end of a long day. She said it was just age catching up with her, said she needed more sleep than she used to. My wife told me I was being paranoid. My brother said the same thing. Mum herself kept insisting she was fine, just needed to slow down a little bit. But I'd always been the one who paid attention to things, the one who noticed when something was off, even always. And nobody else wanted to see it. I couldn't ignore it. I got her to go to the doctor in October, had to practically drag her there, arguing that it was just routine, just to check up that there was nothing to worry about. She went reluctantly, annoyed with me for making a fuss, for treating her like she was fragile, and 3 weeks later we got the diagnosis that none of us were expecting. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The words seemed to hang in the air of that doctor's office like something physical, like a weight. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't usually have a good ending. The kind that people talk about in hushed voices. The kind that made everyone's faces look like they'd just eaten something bitter. The next 3 months were a blur of treatment plans and specialist appointments and consultations, with oncologists who spoke in percentages and survival rates like they were talking about weather. Mum tried the chemo even though she didn't want to. She did it for me, she said, for all of us, like she was doing us a favour by trying to stay alive. She lost her hair in November, and I took her shopping for scarves because she refused to wear a wig. She still wanted to look like herself as much as possible. She had her dignity, and she wasn't going to lose that if she could help it. She insisted on continuing her volunteer work at the library for as long as she could. She kept hosting Sunday dinners, though they became quieter, smaller, with Mum spending less time at the table and more time resting in her bedroom. By December, she could barely eat. The weight came off her in pounds every week. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. She looked like she was disappearing. By early January, after a particularly difficult Christmas, she made the decision to move into Riverside Hospice. She was ready. She didn't want to die at home, didn't want me and my brother and my wife to have to clean up after her, to remember her that way. She wanted her final chapter to happen in a place designed for endings. So we set her up in that room with the nice window that looked out at the garden, even though the garden was asleep in winter, and we said goodbye in a way that we all understood meant forever. That last month in hospice was compressed somehow, like all the time in the world and no time at all happening at once. It was surreal. I visited every day. I brought her tea she couldn't drink and read her book she couldn't focus on. I held her hand. I talked to her about memories, about the good times, about anything that wasn't about dying. We talked about the day I was born. We talked about family vacations. We talked about the time I was 8 and fell off my bike and she nursed me back to health. Patricia and the other nurses were wonderful. They kept Mum comfortable, kept her as pain-free as possible. They were kind in a way that made me believe maybe there was still good in the world, even when that world was taking someone from me, even when everything felt dark and hopeless. She died on a Tuesday morning. I was there, my brother was there. We sat with her for hours after, not wanting to leave, not wanting to accept that she was gone. That day felt like the worst day of my life. I couldn't imagine anything worse than burying your mother. Couldn't imagine the loss being deeper than that. And then came the week after the funeral. It was a particularly rough week, even before Patricia's call. My business had been suffering since I'd taken time off to care for Mom and then to grieve. That was understandable. People needed compassion. People understood that sometimes life happens and business takes a back seat. What wasn't understandable was how my son-in-law handled it. He saw my vulnerability and he decided to use it. He came to a family meeting about the business on Wednesday afternoon, came to discuss strategy and client relationships and the direction we were heading. I had notes. I had ideas. I'd been thinking about ways to pivot, ways to use this reset period to rebuild stronger, to come back different. I was hopeful. Maybe grief teaches you things about what actually matters. My son-in-law walked in with what he called a sure thing. A massive contract with an investor who wanted to fund a big expansion project. $3 million. He was confident, cocky even. He started presenting and everyone seemed impressed. He had glossy presentations on his laptop, talked about numbers and projections like he was some kind of genius. He was doing this thing where he kept making little jabs at me. Subtle things, dismissive things, references to deals I hadn't made or opportunities I'd let pass. At one point, he actually said it out loud in front of my daughter and my brother in front of everyone. You can't even handle a simple deal. Stay quiet. Everyone snickered. Not in a funny way, in an uncomfortable way. The kind of laugh that makes your stomach hurt because you know what you're hearing is a humiliation dressed up as a joke. But they snickered. My daughter looked embarrassed, my brother looked away, and I just sat there, feeling the weight of the week, the month, the year, the loss, feeling raw and exposed and not in the right headspace to defend myself or stand up for myself. I was running on fumes. I was running on grief and lack of sleep, and the hollow feeling of not having my mother in the world anymore. So I stayed quiet. I listened to him talk about this amazing opportunity, this investor who was supposedly ready to write a check for $3 million. He was talking about what he'd do with it, how it would change everything, change his life. He was already spending the money in his head, already planning the expansion, already imagining the success. Then his phone lit up on the table, a message came through. He glanced at it and his face went pale. White, actually. Like all the blood had drained out of it. He kept reading. More messages came. His hands started shaking. His hands were actually shaking. He excused himself without a word and walked into the other room. We all sat there, uncomfortable, not knowing what to do, pretending not to notice that something was very wrong. I could hear him talking on the phone, his voice getting louder, more panicked. When he came back, the swagger was gone. Completely gone. The whole deal had fallen through. The investor had pulled all $3 million of it. Gone. He sat down slowly, his face grey, and didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. Just sat there in shock. I remember looking at him across that table, this man who'd just humiliated me in front of my family, sitting there completely destroyed. This man who'd made a joke out of my pain when I was already drowning in it. I could have said something cruel. Should have. Maybe. There was a moment where I thought about it, but I was too tired, too sad, too full of grief to care about winning that particular moment or getting some kind of revenge. I just closed my laptop and said, "Some deals require competence," and I left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a dramatic exit. I just left. That was Thursday. Patricia's call came Wednesday night, one day before that humiliation. I didn't sleep that night after her call. I tried. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me, all those empty spaces where my mother was supposed to be, all the silence that she used to fill. At some point around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep. I got out of bed, got dressed, and started driving. The hospice was 40 minutes away under normal circumstances. I made it in 35. I was driving too fast. I was probably speeding through residential neighbourhoods and I didn't care. I needed to know. I needed to understand what Patricia was talking about. The parking lot was mostly empty at 4 a.m. There were a few cars, probably night shift stuff, but mostly it was just empty spaces. I pulled into a spot near the entrance and just sat there for a while. Engine running. Not quite ready to go inside. Not quite ready to find out what Patricia needed to show me. There was something terrifying about not knowing. Something worse than the actual knowledge, because at least with knowledge you could act. You could do something. You could make sense of things. This was just uncertainty and dread, and it was eating me alive from the inside out. I thought about my mother as I sat there in the dark. I thought about her in that room. I thought about those last weeks, those conversations we had, all the things she said to me. Had she been hiding something? Had she been in pain beyond just the cancer? Had someone hurt her and she hadn't told me? The thought made me feel sick. The thought that something could have happened to her and she hadn't told me, or couldn't tell me, or didn't want to worry me. Finally, I got out of the car. The air was cold. It was late January and everything was frozen and dead looking. I walked toward the entrance of the hospice, my shoes loud on the pavement. The doors slid open with that automatic whisper that all hospital doors have, and I was inside. When I finally walked through those doors, the hallway looked exactly like I remembered it. The same beige walls, the same soft lighting meant to be calming, the same faint smell of cleaning products mixed with something else, something that was probably just the smell of illness and medicine and endings. It was a smell I'd gotten used to over those final weeks, a smell I hoped I'd never smell again. The nurse station was lit up. There were a couple of people working there, but they didn't look up as I passed. Patricia was in her office. I could see her through the glass wall. She was standing by the window looking out at the dark parking lot, and she looked exhausted, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. Patricia turned and saw me come in. She looked like she hadn't slept either. She looked like she'd been waiting for me, steeling herself for this conversation, preparing herself to say things she probably wasn't supposed to say. She stood up when she saw me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. We just stood there, two people about to cross a line. "Thank you for coming," she said finally, and there was relief in her voice, but also something else, something like dread, something like she was about to tell me something terrible, and she'd been carrying it alone for days, carrying it and not knowing what to do with it. I wasn't sure if you would. I wasn't sure if I should even have called, but I kept thinking about your mother, about what she told me in those final days, about the things she said to me when she thought nobody else was listening, and I realized I didn't have a choice. "You need to know. You deserve to know." "Know what?" I asked. "Patricia, what is this about? Did someone hurt her? Did something go wrong with her care?" She glanced around the hallway, checking to make sure we were alone. A night shift aide was somewhere down the corridor, but nobody was nearby. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not where anyone else might hear. Come on, let's go somewhere private." She led me down the corridor, past the rooms where other people's mothers and fathers and grandparents were finishing their lives. Some of the doors were open, and I could see people sleeping, machines beeping quietly, nightlights casting shadows. We went to Mum's room, the room where she'd spent her final weeks, where I'd sat holding her hand, where she'd taken her last breath. It looked different now. The bed was bare, stripped down to the plastic mattress. The machines were gone. There were no flowers in the vase on the windowsill. There were no traces of her at all. It looked like a room that had been sanitized of every sign that a person had actually lived and died there, like it was just waiting for the next person to come and die in it. "Your mother was a wonderful woman," Patricia said. We were standing in the doorway now, and she was speaking quietly, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "I want you to know that." She was kind and graceful, and she bore her illness with more dignity than most people I've ever seen. She never complained. She was always concerned about me, about the other nurses, about making things easier for us. That matters. That should matter to you, no matter what comes next. I want you to know that about her final days, that she was still her, she was still your mother. "What comes next?" I asked. My voice sounded strange, even to me, like it was coming from very far away, like it was someone else's voice. Patricia took a deep breath. She looked like she was making a decision, like she was about to cross some line that she couldn't uncross, some professional line that couldn't be uncrossed. Like she was willing to risk her career for this, for my mother. "There was something I found," she said slowly, "after she passed. Something that I think explained some things, about her final days, about her care, about what happened to her before she came here, about where those marks came from." My mind was racing now. "Marks? What marks?" I asked. "Patricia, what are you talking about?" "Come with me," she said. She took my arm and led me deeper into the hospice, away from the patient rooms, into an administrative office tucked in the back. She closed the door behind us and locked it. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a folder. Then she sat down, gestured for me to sit across from her, and opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a photograph. It was Mom, but it wasn't Mom in a way that made my stomach drop and my breath catch in my throat and the world tilt on its axis. Mom had bruises on her body, bruises that couldn't be explained by age or fragility or weakness from cancer, bruises that looked like someone had grabbed her with force, deliberate force, angry force. Patricia flipped through more photographs, her arms, her shoulders, her rib cage, her legs, all of it marked with marks that looked like fingerprints, like someone had been rough with her, had hurt her on purpose, had left evidence of that hurt on her skin. "When she first came to us," Patricia said quietly, "we did a full intake assessment, standard procedure, and Dr. Matthews noted these marks. But your mother was very insistent that she'd fallen. She said it wasn't important. She said she wanted to focus on being comfortable, not on some minor injuries. She said she didn't want to make a fuss, so we documented it, but we didn't push her. That was Dr. Matthews's call, and he made it with good intentions, but he should have pushed. He should have done more." I couldn't speak. I was staring at the photographs of my mother's bruised body, and my mind was trying to make sense of it. Falling couldn't explain these marks. These were systematic. These were the marks of someone hurting her. Someone being deliberate, someone doing this on purpose. "There's more," Patricia said. She pulled out another document, a note, handwritten in my mother's shaky script. It was dated the day before she died. It said, "For my son, in case anything happens to me. You need to know the truth about what really happened to me, about who did this to me. Please read this. Please listen." Patricia slid the folder across the desk toward me. I picked it up with shaking hands. I tried to read the note, but the words kept swimming on the page. My eyes couldn't focus. Everything felt surreal. "How did she get these bruises?" I asked. "When did this happen?" "Before she came here," Patricia said. She was watching me carefully. "The intake assessment shows these injuries were just a few days old when she arrived. Some were already healing." "Who would do this to her?" I asked, staring at the photographs of my mother's bruised arms, the marks that looked like fingers on her shoulders. Patricia just looked at me, her expression saying what she wouldn't say aloud. She gestured toward the note. I looked down at my mother's handwriting. Even weak and shaky, I recognized it. She was telling me something important, something that had happened in those last days before she came to the hospice. "Read it," Patricia said quietly. "Read what she wrote, from the beginning." I opened the folder wider. There wasn't just one note, there were several pages, multiple notes in my mother's handwriting, dated over several days. Like she'd been documenting it all, making sure I would know if something happened to her. I started reading. The more I read, the more everything changed. Everything I thought I knew about those final weeks of my mother's life shattered. By the time I finished, I understood. I understood what Patricia was telling me. I understood what my mother had been trying to tell me. And I understood that nothing would ever be the same. I understood that nothing would ever be the same. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages. I read through them again, forcing myself to slow down, to really absorb what Mum had written in those final days before she checked into the hospice. The handwriting was shaky, sometimes illegible, but the meaning was unmistakable. Someone had hurt her. Someone had deliberately and physically hurt her, and she'd documented it all, detailed it all, like a cop filing a report. She'd been a librarian her whole life, not a cop, but she had that same instinct about things, that same need to get things in order, to make sure the truth wouldn't get lost, to make sure someone would know what really happened. The first note was dated December 27th, just 2 weeks before she died. It said, "I don't know how to write this down. I don't know how to tell my son what happened without it destroying him. But I need to write it. I need to have it somewhere in case something happens to me, in case they come back." Who was they? The note didn't say. Not yet, anyway. Patricia was watching my face as I read, and I could see the sympathy there, but also something else. A kind of professional concern. The concern of someone who's seen abuse before, who knows the patterns, who knows what it means when someone's mother comes into hospice with bruises that don't match the story she's telling. "Keep reading," Patricia said gently. She got up and went to the door, checked the hallway, then came back and locked it again. "I've kept these locked away. Nobody else knows about them. I should have reported it. I should have done more. But your mother made me promise. She said if I reported it, they would find out and they would come back, and this time they might finish what they started." I looked up from the pages. Who is they? Patricia, who hurt my mother? She sat back down slowly. "That's for you to read. She tells you in the notes. But there's something else you need to understand first. Something about the timing of her cancer diagnosis. About when her condition really started to deteriorate." Patricia took a breath. "Your mother didn't come to us because her cancer got worse. She came to us because she was afraid for her life, and the cancer was a convenient excuse. Nobody would question it. Nobody would think to look deeper. People see someone dying of cancer and they don't ask hard questions, they don't pry. They offer sympathy and let you be, and I think your mother understood that. I think she used her diagnosis as a way to get away from whatever situation she was in, a way to remove herself without having to explain the real reason. I tried to process that. It seemed impossible and obvious at the same time. But she was really sick. She really was dying." "Yes," Patricia said. "She had pancreatic cancer and it was aggressive and it was going to kill her. But she might have had a few more months if she'd stayed home, if she'd kept fighting, if she'd done the chemo like the doctors wanted. Instead, she came here and she gave up the fighting, and I think part of that was because she was relieved. I think part of her was grateful to have a place to hide." The room felt very small all of a sudden. The air felt thin, like there wasn't enough oxygen to breathe properly. I looked around at those grey walls and tried to imagine my mother lying in hospice, pretending to be dying because it was safer than staying home with someone who was hurting her. I looked down at the pages in my hands and started reading again, this time all the way through, cover to cover, every word Mum had written in that shaky script that looked like it hurt to write. She wrote about Christmas morning. She wrote about a phone call that came early before anyone else was awake. She wrote about opening the front door to find her brother, my Uncle David, standing there with a look on his face that frightened her. She wrote about how he'd pushed his way inside without being invited, how he'd started asking her questions about her finances, about her will, about whether she'd updated it recently. She wrote about how she'd told him it wasn't his business, and how his demeanour had changed, how he'd gone from casual to something much darker, how he'd grabbed her arm and demanded to know what she'd planned to do with her money, if she'd left anything to him, if she understood how much he'd sacrificed over the years to be a good brother. And then he'd hit her, just once, across the face, but it had sent her stumbling backward, and she'd hit her head on the kitchen counter. He'd grabbed her again after that, his hands on her shoulders, shaking her, asking her over and over if she was listening to him, if she understood what he was saying, if she understood what kind of person he was, how serious he was about this, how much money he needed. The notes went on from there. They documented what happened over the next few days in a kind of clinical detail that broke my heart, because it was so matter-of-fact, so careful, so precise. How David had come back 3 more times, how he'd grown increasingly violent, increasingly unhinged, how he'd talked about money she supposedly owed him, how he'd mentioned a gambling debt that was out of control, maybe $200,000, how he'd told her he'd kill himself if he didn't get help, how he'd manipulated her by saying she was his only family, his only hope, his only chance at redemption. How he'd cried and then screamed and then threatened all within the span of minutes. How he'd said things that made it clear he was counting on her will, counting on her dying and leaving him the money, counting on her being his way out of whatever financial hole he'd dug himself into. In one note, Mum had written exactly what he said. He told me that when I die, he'll be fine, that my life insurance and the house are his golden ticket. He said he could finally be happy if I would just die. Those words felt like a knife in my chest because she'd written them knowing I would read them eventually, knowing she might not survive his next visit, knowing that she was documenting her own potential murder. And then, on December 31st, in the final note, Mom wrote, "If anything happens to me, if this gets worse, if he comes back and does something more, I want my son to know that I love him. I want him to know that none of this is his fault, and I want him to know the truth about his uncle. I want him to know what kind of man David really is, because if I don't tell him now, David will tell some version of the story that protects himself, and that's not justice. That's just letting evil win by default." I looked up from the pages. Patricia was crying. Silent tears were running down her face, and she was watching me with an expression of such sorrow that I felt something break open inside my chest. "When did she write the last one?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "New Year's Day," Patricia said. "The day before she came to us. And I think that's the day she decided to come. I think she knew he was going to come back, and she knew what might happen if he did. So she got herself to safety by telling us she needed hospice care. She framed it as wanting to be comfortable while she died. But I think she was running. I think she was trying to protect you and protect herself at the same time. I thought about my uncle, David. I hadn't seen him much over the years. He lived in another state, had his own life, had always seemed kind of distant from the family. He'd show up at Christmas sometimes, he'd call Mum on her birthday, but I'd never been particularly close to him. I'd never really thought much about him at all, to be honest. He was just Uncle David, the guy who was always broke, always had some business idea that was about to take off, always seemed to be in some kind of crisis or another. And all that time he'd been circling my mother like a predator, waiting for the moment when she'd be vulnerable enough to take advantage of. "What do we do?" I asked Patricia. "What do I do with this information?" "That's not my decision," she said quietly. "But I think you need to contact the police. I think you need to get official statements on record. I think you need to protect yourself and anyone else in your family from this man, because if he was willing to do this to your mother, he might be willing to do it to someone else." I sat in that office for hours. I read through the notes again and again, trying to digest them, trying to make sense of the fact that my mother had been keeping this secret from me, that she'd been hurt and hadn't told me, that she'd died protecting me from the knowledge of what her own brother had done to her, that she'd documented it all so carefully, so methodically, so that the truth would be preserved even if something happened to her. Eventually, Patricia left me alone. The sun started to come up outside the window of her office. Grey light filtered in, becoming warmer and more yellow as the January morning progressed. I was still sitting there with my mother's notes in my lap when Patricia came back with coffee and a suggestion. "You should go to the police station," she said. "You should bring these notes. You should file a report. They'll know what to do from there. They'll be able to investigate. They'll be able to question your uncle. They'll be able to determine if there's enough evidence for charges." So that's what I did. I drove from the hospice to the police station downtown. I sat in an interview room with a detective named Morrison, a woman in her 50s with grey in her hair and kind eyes that had seen a lot of things they probably shouldn't have seen. I handed her the folder with the notes, the photographs of the bruises, the medical documentation that Patricia had compiled, and I told her everything my mother had written, everything that had happened in those final weeks before she came to the hospice, everything that had led her to die in that place with safety as her primary concern rather than comfort. Detective Morrison read through the notes carefully. She took her time. She didn't rush. She didn't make assumptions. She just read and documented and took notes of her own. When she was done, she looked at me over the top of her glasses and said, "We'll need to bring your uncle in for questioning. We'll need to get his statement. We'll need to see if there are any other incidents, any pattern of behaviour. Do you want to be present during the interview?" I told her yes. I wanted to see my uncle's face when she asked him about what he'd done. I wanted to see if he'd deny it or admit it or try to justify it. I wanted to understand how a man could hurt his own sister and then come to her funeral and stand in the pews with the rest of the family and pretend like nothing had happened. But there was something else I needed to do first. There was someone else I needed to talk to. I needed to confront the other people who'd been in my mother's life during those final weeks. The people who should have noticed something was wrong. The people who should have asked questions. I drove to my brother's house. He lived about 20 minutes away, in a neighbourhood filled with young families and big houses and manicured lawns. He was just getting home from work when I pulled into his driveway. He saw my car and waved, smiling, not understanding yet what was coming, not understanding that everything was about to change. "Hey," he said as I got out of the car. "What's going on? Is everything okay? You look terrible. Seriously, are you okay?" "Can we go inside?" I asked. "I need to talk to you about something, about Mom, about what really happened before she went to the hospice." His face changed. The smile faded. He looked like someone who'd just realised something bad was coming, but didn't know what it was yet. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let me unlock the door." We went inside. His wife was in the kitchen making dinner. He asked her to give us some privacy, and she took the kids upstairs. Then we sat in the living room and I told him everything. I showed him the notes. I showed him the photographs of the bruises, and I watched his face as he looked at our mother's damaged skin, at the evidence of someone's violence captured in medical documentation. I told him that Uncle David had been visiting Mom and hurting her, threatening her, demanding money. I told him that Mom had been documenting it all but hadn't told either of us because she didn't want to worry us, because she didn't want us to do something that might make it worse. I told him about the life insurance, about how David had apparently asked Mom directly about her will, about what she was planning to leave him. I told him about the gambling debts, about the casino visits, about the money David didn't have and the desperation that was driving him to hurt his own sister. My brother's face went through about 10 different emotions in the span of 30 seconds. Shock, denial, anger, grief, understanding. The kind of horrible realization that we'd both failed our mother in some fundamental way. That we'd been so consumed with our own lives, our own problems, that we hadn't been paying attention. We hadn't been there for her when she needed us most. "Jesus Christ," he said finally, standing up and walking to the window. He stood there for a long time, not saying anything, just staring out at the street. How did we not know? How did she not tell us? Why would she protect him? She wasn't protecting him, I said. She was protecting us. She was trying to handle it in a way that wouldn't blow up our family, and look what it cost her. The police investigation took weeks. Detective Morrison brought Uncle David in for questioning, and he came in confident, cocky even. He denied everything. He said Mum had been confused, that her cancer had affected her mind, that the bruises were from her being frail and clumsy. He said she probably fell or bumped into things. He said she was on pain medication that made her think things that weren't true. He painted himself as the concerned brother who was just trying to check on his dying sister. But then they found evidence, real evidence. They found records of financial crimes he'd committed in 3 different states over the past 5 years. They found bank statements showing large withdrawals before and after his visits to see Mom. They subpoenaed his financial records and found the gambling, the debts, the loans he'd taken out and defaulted on. They found witnesses at casinos who recognized his photo and remembered him being there, losing money, getting desperate, asking people if they knew anyone who would loan him money fast. They found credit cards maxed out, collection agencies calling, a man in financial free fall looking for anything to save him. And then they found something else. They found that Mum wasn't the first person he'd done this to. There was an ex-wife who'd filed a protective order against him 8 years ago. Her name was Jennifer. The police tracked her down, and Detective Morrison said she cried when she heard that David had done this to someone else. She cried because she knew exactly what Mum had gone through, because she'd experienced similar things, because she'd gotten out but had never managed to hold him accountable. There were allegations of assault against Jennifer. There were patterns of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. There were other people too. An old girlfriend who said David had stolen money from her, a former business partner who said David had defrauded him. The police built a case. They gathered evidence. They documented everything, and with each new piece of evidence, it became clear that David wasn't just a desperate man making bad decisions. He was a predator. He was someone who used relationships and intimacy as a weapon, someone who targeted vulnerable people and exploited them. The prosecutors looked at what they had and decided to file charges: assault, harassment, attempted extortion, financial elder abuse, conspiracy to commit murder, because the detectives believed that if Mum hadn't gotten herself to the hospice when she did, David's behaviour would have escalated to something worse. He would have lost control completely. He would have done something that couldn't be undone. My brother and I had to go to court. We had to sit in a courtroom with my uncle sitting on the other side with lawyers and judges and all the machinery of justice grinding away. We had to listen to evidence being presented. We had to watch my uncle try to defend himself, try to minimise what he'd done, try to convince the judge that he wasn't as bad as he seemed. We had to hear Detective Morrison present the notes Mum had written and watch the judge's face as she read those words, as she understood the fear and pain that had driven my mother to document her own abuse. In the end, David was convicted. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He was ordered to pay restitution to Mum's estate. He was told that he would never be allowed to contact me or my brother or my mother's memory in any way ever again. The judge was very clear about that. She said that what he'd done was a betrayal of the most fundamental kind, that he'd violated the sanctity of family, that he'd exploited his sister's vulnerability and her love for him in ways that were almost incomprehensible. And when it was over, when the sentence was handed down and he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. I felt sad. I felt sad that my mother's brother had turned into someone capable of this. I felt sad that she'd spent her final weeks afraid of him. I felt sad that she'd had to protect us from the knowledge of what he'd done. I felt sad that the family was broken now in a way that could never really be fixed. But I also felt something else. I felt angry. I felt a deep, righteous anger at the injustice of it all, at the fact that my mother had been hurt and hadn't felt like she could tell me, at the fact that we'd both been going through our own things, dealing with our own problems, and hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice that she was in danger, at the fact that evil had come into our family in the form of someone we trusted, and it had taken her death to bring it into the light. Patricia called me a few weeks after the sentencing. She said she wanted to see me. She said there was something else she wanted to show me, something else about Mum's final days that might give me some peace. So I drove back to the hospice. I went to Patricia's office again and she showed me something she'd been saving. It was a letter. Mum had written it just before she died. It was addressed to me. I held the envelope in my hands and looked at Patricia. "Should I open it now?" I asked. "That's up to you," she said, "but I think maybe it's time." So I opened it. And I read my mother's words one final time. She wrote about how much she loved me. She wrote about how proud she was of the man I'd become. She wrote about how she knew I would figure out the truth about Uncle David, and she wanted me to know that his actions weren't a reflection of me, or of her, or of our family. She wrote about how she'd chosen to come to the hospice not just because she was dying, but because she wanted to protect me and my brother from the knowledge of what was happening. She wrote that sometimes love means taking on a burden so that the people you care about don't have to carry it. And at the end, she wrote something that has stayed with me ever since. She wrote, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm only afraid of what might happen if I stay. So I'm choosing to go somewhere safe. I'm choosing to protect myself. And I'm choosing to trust that you'll understand why, and that you'll forgive me for not telling you everything. I love you, I always have. I always will. And that was it. That was the end of the letter. That was my mother's final words to me. And I understood then, finally, what Patricia had been trying to tell me all along. My mother hadn't hidden the truth to protect Uncle David. She'd hidden it to protect herself. She'd recognized that she was in danger, and she'd taken action to remove herself from that danger. She'd come to the hospice, gotten herself to safety, and made sure that the truth would eventually come out. She'd done everything she could with the time she had left. And in doing that, she taught me a lesson that I'm still learning. She taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is take care of yourself. That sometimes protecting yourself is the same as protecting the people you love. That sometimes the most courageous thing is to ask for help, to remove yourself from a dangerous situation, to say no to someone who's hurting you, even if that person is family. It took me a long time to process all of this. It took me therapy and conversations with my brother and late nights staring at the ceiling thinking about all the things I should have noticed, all the warning signs I should have picked up on. But eventually I started to understand that grief and rage and guilt and relief can all exist at the same time. That you can love someone and be angry at them for not telling you what was really going on. That you can be proud of them for protecting themselves and sorry that they felt like they had to do it alone. My mother was right about one thing. I did forgive her. Not because she owed me an apology, but because I understood finally that she'd done the best she could with the knowledge and the resources she had. She'd survived her own abuse. She'd documented it. She'd gotten herself to safety, and she'd left me with the truth so that I could learn from her example and make sure that justice was served. That was the real gift she left me. Not just the truth about Uncle David, but the lesson that you don't have to be a victim. You don't have to let people hurt you. You don't have to protect abusers by staying silent. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept being treated badly. You can say no. You can leave. You can document what happened. And you can trust that eventually the truth will come out. That's what my mother did. And that's what I'm trying to do now. But here's the thing I didn't expect. After Uncle David's conviction, after I'd come to terms with what my mother had survived, after I thought I'd learned all the lessons I was supposed to learn about family and betrayal and protection, life had another lesson waiting for me. And it came from the last place I expected it. It came from my son-in-law, Daniel. And it came through the most public, most humiliating experience I'd had in years. I need to back up and explain something about my family business first. My father started a manufacturing company in the 70s, and my brother and I had taken it over about 15 years ago. It was solid work. Nothing glamorous, but reliable income, steady employees, the kind of business that makes a difference in a community. My daughter married Daniel about 8 years before everything with my mother came to light. He was charming back then, ambitious, always talking about his entrepreneurial dreams. My wife loved him. My daughter seemed happy. My brother said he had a good feeling about the guy. I had my doubts, but I kept them to myself. That's what you do when your family's concerned about your inability to just let people be. Then about 2 years ago, Daniel started pushing to get involved with the family business. He wanted a seat at the table, wanted to expand operations, go after bigger contracts, make moves that frankly didn't align with how we'd built the company. He'd show up at the office unannounced and talk about specific deals without consulting us first. He'd present ideas to employees like they were already approved, already in motion, despite having no official role in the company. My brother and I were cautious. We asked to see his business plans, financial projections, partnerships. We wanted to understand what he was proposing. That seemed reasonable. But Daniel got defensive immediately. He said we didn't believe in him, that we were old school, that we didn't understand the modern market. He said things like, "You guys are holding on to the past," and "This is why small businesses stay small." He was probably right about some of that, but we were also right to ask questions. You don't hand over millions to someone without understanding where it's going and what the risks are. Then came the annual family business meeting. It was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in the conference room at our main office. My brother was there. My daughter Emily was there. Her husband Daniel was there with the investor he'd been talking about for weeks. He'd built this deal up like it was the biggest thing to hit our industry in decades. He kept saying he had someone lined up who wanted to pour millions into expansion. He kept saying this investor was going to change everything. He kept saying that everyone who doubted him was about to eat their words. The meeting started at 2 o'clock. Daniel came in wearing an expensive suit, very unlike his usual casual vibe, and he had this energy about him that I'd never seen before. Manic almost. He was pacing before we even sat down, like he couldn't contain the excitement, the confidence, the momentum he was riding. He had a folder full of documents, glossy printouts, financial projections, marketing materials, architectural renderings of new facilities, all this stuff that looked very polished and very expensive. The kind of presentation materials that cost money to produce, the kind that are designed to impress and overwhelm rather than inform. He started his presentation by talking about this investor, this supposedly legendary venture capitalist from the West Coast who was apparently revolutionizing multiple industries. The guy had a track record, or so Daniel said. He'd made billions in tech and was now looking to diversify into manufacturing. He was specifically interested in our industry, apparently. He saw potential where others saw risk. He threw out numbers, millions in capital, tens of millions, expansion targets that would triple our current operation, new markets in Asia, Europe, Mexico, contracts with Fortune 500 companies, also the projection sheet suggested. All of it sounding incredibly promising and also incredibly risky, the kind of deal that could either make everyone rich or sink us completely. My brother asked the first tough question. Where exactly was this investor? Why weren't they at the meeting if it was such a big deal? Daniel said they were tied up elsewhere, but they'd committed. The paperwork was almost done. Everything would be official within hours. He said the investor had given him full authority to handle negotiations. That's what happened with sophisticated deals at this level. The investor didn't personally meet every potential partner, but he assured us the investor was real, the money was real, the commitment was real. Then he looked directly at me and made his move. He said, "You know what your problem is? You can't even handle a simple deal. You can't even handle a simple deal. Stay quiet while the rest of us talk about the future." He said it loud enough that everyone in the room heard him clearly. He said it with a laugh, like he was joking, trying to play it off as good-natured ribbing, but his eyes weren't laughing. His eyes were cold, calculating, deliberately cruel. He was trying to establish dominance in that moment. He was trying to diminish me in front of witnesses. He was trying to make sure that everyone in the room understood that he was the one with vision, the one with the big ideas, and I was just an old man holding everyone back. He kept going. He said my generation was too conservative, too afraid, too stuck in the past. He said that Emily had told him I'd always been that way, always too cautious, always holding people back. He brought my daughter into it, used her as a weapon against me, made it seem like she agreed with him, like she'd been complaining about me behind my back. And then he hit the finale. He said I should just stay quiet and let the people with vision handle things. He actually said that. Stay quiet. As if that was an option, as if I didn't have the right to ask questions about proposals that would affect my company, my employees, my family's future. Everyone in that room froze. I could see my brother's face getting red, his fist clenching on top of the table. I could see Emily shrinking down in her chair, uncomfortable with what was happening, embarrassed by her husband's behaviour, probably already wondering if she'd married the right man. I could see the investor, a man I'd never met before, watching to see how I'd react, trying to gauge what kind of family he'd be working with. And I could see Daniel, triumphant, like he'd just delivered the perfect insult in front of an audience, like he'd successfully intimidated the old man into silence. I kept my expression neutral. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get defensive or angry or reactive. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I just said very calmly, "Let's hear about this investor. Let's see the documentation. Let's understand the actual terms." I was refusing to be bullied. I was refusing to play the game he was trying to play. I was asking the questions that needed to be asked. Daniel bristled visibly. He didn't like that response. He wanted me to get angry, wanted me to look like the unreasonable one, the difficult one, the obstacle. But I wasn't going to give him that, so he went ahead with his presentation anyway, showing the projections, talking about the money, painting this picture of unlimited potential. For the next hour he talked, and as he talked, I started asking questions, specific questions. Where was the money coming from? Who exactly was this venture capitalist? What were the terms of the investment? What was our liability if things went wrong? What had they signed? Could I see the agreements? Daniel got more and more irritated with each question. He started saying things like, "You're being paranoid," and "This is why you never accomplish anything, and some people are just meant to stay small." But he didn't have good answers to my questions. He had glossy brochures and optimistic projections, but he didn't have substance. At one point I said to him very calmly, "Some deals require competence." That was all I said, just that. And I stood up and walked out of the conference room. I walked through the office, out to my car and drove home. I left Emily and my brother sitting there with Daniel and his investor. I left them to figure it out without me. I didn't hear from anyone for about 3 hours. Then my phone started buzzing. Text messages, calls, voicemail. Daniel was texting insults. Emily was apologizing. My brother was calling, trying to figure out what had just happened. I didn't respond to any of it. I sat in my living room with a drink, trying to decide if I was angry or disappointed or just tired. In the end, I was all three. Then, around 6 o'clock in the evening, Daniel showed up at my house. He drove straight from the office and stormed up to my front door and started pounding on it, like he was trying to break it down. I opened the door before he could do any real damage, and he started screaming at me. He said I'd humiliated him in front of his investor. He said I'd sabotaged his deal. He said I'd proven exactly what he'd always suspected, which was that I was fundamentally unable to support anyone else's success because my own had been so limited. He was yelling so loud that neighbours probably heard him. I listened without saying anything. When he ran out of breath, I said, "I think you should leave," and closed the door. I didn't wait to see if he'd argue or start pounding again. I just closed the door and listened to him yelling on the other side for about 30 seconds before he gave up and walked away. What I didn't know was that while I was driving home, and Daniel was pounding on my door, and we were all dealing with the fallout from his public humiliation attempt, his investor was calling him. His phone was probably buzzing with messages. His investor had apparently decided to do some deeper due diligence overnight. They'd looked into the numbers more carefully, the actual numbers, not the glossy projections. They'd discovered that Daniel's company had some serious financial problems that weren't reflected in the presentations. They'd found out that there were liens on several of his properties. They'd discovered unpaid debts to other investors who'd funded his previous ventures. They'd uncovered lawsuits pending against his company. They'd learned that he'd been operating at a loss for years, kept afloat only by constantly seeking new investment to cover the shortfall. The investor apparently had realized they were being scammed. Or not scammed exactly, but certainly being presented with a completely false picture. The deal, it turned out, had been built on sand. It was all smoke and mirrors. Daniel had been counting on that investor to bail him out of financial problems that went back years. He'd been hoping to use that investment, plus our company's credibility and resources, to help him clean up his mess. He was planning to use our money to cover his losses. He was planning to fold our company's assets into his operation and then extract value from it. And when the investor pulled out, when that $3.2 million evaporated, everything collapsed. His company started hemorrhaging money almost immediately once the investment fell through. No new capital coming in, no way to cover the operating losses, no way to pay the debts. Within weeks, he was facing bankruptcy. Collection agencies started calling. Creditors started demanding payment. The liens on his properties became an issue. The lawsuits moved forward. The whole house of cards came down, and it came down fast. When the full picture came out, when I finally understood what had actually happened, when I started connecting the dots and seeing the whole architecture of the lie, I realized something important. Daniel hadn't really been insulting me because he thought I was wrong about the deal. He'd been lashing out because he was desperate. He'd been cruel because he was terrified. He'd tried to humiliate me publicly because he needed everyone to believe in him, needed everyone to think he had everything under control, needed everyone to trust that this deal was real and solid and guaranteed to succeed. My questions were a threat to him. Not because they were unfair or unreasonable, but because they could reveal the truth, and the truth would destroy everything. The irony was that if he'd just been honest with us from the beginning, if he'd told us what his real financial situation was, we might have been able to help. My brother and I had money. We had resources. We had experience navigating business problems and financial crises. We weren't heartless people. We were family. If Daniel had come to us and said, "I'm in trouble, I need help, here's what I owe, and here's what I'm trying to do to fix it," we probably would have listened. We probably would have at least considered helping him, either directly with the company or with personal funds. But instead, he lied. He built an elaborate fantasy. He created false documentation. He invented an investor who didn't really exist, or at least not in the way he described. He tried to intimidate me into not asking hard questions. He tried to shame me into silence. He tried to make me feel like I was the problem for being cautious, the obstacle for asking for verification, the bad guy for wanting to protect my company and my employees. And in doing all that, he made the situation so much worse. Not just for himself, but for our entire family. What came after the investor pullout was a cascade of disasters, each revealing another layer of deception. Emily started wondering what else he'd lied about. She looked into their finances, going through statements, bank accounts, credit card bills. She discovered credit card debt in her name, tens of thousands of dollars for cards she'd never applied for. She discovered he'd taken out a second mortgage on their house without her knowledge, forging her signature. She found collection agencies calling, lawsuits pending, judgments from other states. His business had been bleeding money for years, deeper in debt than anyone realized. But worse than all of that was the realization that the man she'd married, the man she'd promised to spend her life with, the man she'd defended to her family when we expressed concerns, had been systematically lying to her. He'd lied about his finances, he'd lied about his business, he'd lied about his investments, he'd lied about why he wanted to get involved with our company, he'd lied about his intentions, he'd lied about everything. Our family went through something very similar to what we'd gone through with Uncle David, but in fast motion. The same feelings of betrayal, the same realization that someone we'd trusted had been manipulating us, the same anger and shame and confusion about what to do next. Except this time there was Emily's marriage involved. There was her house at stake. There were years of her life that she'd invested in someone who had been deceiving her the whole time. Emily hired a divorce attorney. We had to have family meetings about what this meant for my daughter, what it meant for the company, what it meant for all of us, and what it meant for rebuilding trust after it had been shattered so completely. And through all of it, I kept thinking about what my mother had written in those final letters. I kept thinking about her words. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is take care of yourself. Sometimes protecting yourself is the same as protecting the people you love. Sometimes the most courageous thing is to ask for help, to remove yourself from a dangerous situation, to say no to someone who's hurting you, even if that person is family. I'd done that in the conference room when I asked hard questions. I'd refused to be bullied into accepting a bad deal. I'd refused to play along with Daniel's fantasy. I'd said no, and then I'd removed myself from the situation. And it had felt like weakness in that moment. It had felt like I was the problem, the unambitious old man holding everyone back. But it turned out to be exactly right. It turned out to be the one thing that could have saved us from a much bigger disaster. If I'd just accepted what Daniel was telling me, if I'd let myself be shamed into staying quiet, we would have gotten involved with that investor and his company. We would have put money into something that was built on a foundation of lies and desperation. We would have been dragged into his financial collapse along with him. My brother and I could have lost significant assets. The company we'd built could have been damaged or compromised. But because I asked questions, because I insisted on seeing documentation, because I refused to be bullied into silence, we stayed clean. We didn't get sucked into his mess. And more importantly, we were able to help Emily navigate what came next. She divorced him. She kept the house because it was in her name before the second mortgage was taken out, though the legal battle for that was complicated and expensive. She lost some money that she contributed to his business ventures over the years, but she was able to recover most of what mattered. It took years, but she rebuilt her finances, she rebuilt her life, and now, years later, she's doing well, she's happy, she's with someone who respects her, someone who doesn't try to manipulate her, someone who doesn't use shame and humiliation as a tool to get what he wants. When I look back on everything that happened, I see a pattern. I see my uncle trying to manipulate my mother with the threat of violence and financial desperation. I see my son-in-law trying to manipulate me and my family with shame and bullying and elaborate lies, and in both cases the right response was the same. It was to recognize the manipulation for what it was. It was to refuse to participate in it. It was to ask hard questions and demand truthful answers. It was to be willing to say no, to be willing to close doors, to be willing to remove yourself from situations that weren't serving you. My mother tried to protect me from knowing what my uncle had done. She tried to handle it on her own, and in the end she had to remove herself from the situation entirely just to be safe. She went to the hospice not because her cancer was worse, but because staying home had become a matter of survival. I wish she'd told me. I wish I'd been able to help her carry that burden. I wish I'd been there to protect her the way I should have been. But I understand now why she didn't tell me. She was trying to protect me from having to carry the knowledge of what her own brother was capable of doing. She was trying to protect my brother. She was trying to protect the family in the way she understood how, which was to remove herself from the problem rather than expose everyone to it. With Daniel, I was able to do what my mother couldn't do for herself. I was able to see the threat for what it was before it caused catastrophic damage. I was able to protect my family by refusing to participate in the lie, by asking hard questions, by insisting on verification and documentation. I was able to say no and mean it and follow through. I was able to close a door and not look back. I didn't let shame or social pressure or family dynamics manipulate me into compliance. I didn't let his anger or his accusations or his public humiliation attempt move me off the position that made sense. That's the real lesson. That's what all of this has been trying to teach me. It's not just about having a strong will or a tough exterior, or the ability to handle yourself in difficult situations. It's about understanding when a situation has become dangerous, about recognizing the signs of manipulation and deception before they trap you completely, about being willing to protect yourself and the people you love, even when that means saying no to family, even when it means being perceived as the problem, even when it means standing alone in a room that suddenly feels very full of judgment and hostility. My mother learned that lesson the hard way. She learned it through violence and fear and the realization that sometimes the people closest to you can hurt you the most. She learned it by becoming a target, by documenting her own abuse, by realizing that survival sometimes means isolation, sometimes means removing yourself entirely from the people and situations that are destroying you. I learned it by watching her learn it, and then by experiencing my own version of it with Daniel. I learned it through the public humiliation, through the anger and the accusation, through realizing that sometimes people will try to silence you through shame because the truth threatens them. And now, I'm trying to pass that lesson on, not through tragedy or violence or manipulation, but through understanding, through sharing the story, through making sure that the people I care about know that it's okay to say no, it's okay to ask hard questions, it's okay to refuse to participate in someone else's lies, it's okay to close a door and keep it closed, even if the person on the other side of it is screaming and accusing you of being the problem. That's the real power, that's the real strength. It's not in winning or getting revenge or proving someone wrong. It's not in the satisfaction of being right while someone else is destroyed by their own poor choices. It's in knowing when to walk away. It's in understanding that sometimes the best thing you can do is remove yourself from the situation and let the consequences fall where they may, without needing to watch or participate or validate yourself through someone else's downfall. It's in being willing to be the one who says the hard things, who asks the hard questions, who refuses to play along even when everyone else is. That takes clarity and backbone and a willingness to be unpopular, to be misunderstood, to be labelled as the obstacle. It takes knowing when to distinguish between loyalty to people you love and complicity in their destruction. It takes recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable, refuse to participate, refuse to help achieve goals built on deception. My mother did that in her own way. She refused to let her brother's violence go unrecorded. She refused to let the abuse happen in silence, and she refused to let it destroy her family beyond her own experience. She protected us by getting herself to safety. She protected us by documenting what happened. She protected us by trusting that eventually the truth would come out. I did that with Daniel. I refused to let myself be bullied into accepting a bad deal. I refused to let him shame me into silence. I refused to participate in his elaborate lie. And in doing all of that, I protected my family from much worse consequences. These are the lessons. This is what I've learned from my mother's experience and from my own. This is what I try to live by now, and what I try to teach my daughter, even though she's already learned it the hard way. The world will try to manipulate you. The people closest to you might hurt you, but you don't have to accept it. You don't have to stay silent. You don't have to participate in the lie. You can say no. You can ask hard questions, you can close the door, and when you do, when you're willing to do those things, you become something more than just tough or strong or capable. You become someone who refuses to be a victim. You become someone who understands that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. You become someone who knows that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply walk away.